Hi everyone and welcome to this month's main tutorials based on painting cat fur. Such a tricky subject to work on, so I hope you enjoy this really in-depth two-part series totaling around 3 hours worth of tutorial time. Sorry I'm a little late this month releasing the tutorials. You can probably hear in my voice I've got a little bit of hoarseness left over from bronchitis in the past week. So hopefully my voice holds out for the entire tutorial. Hope you enjoy this. So we join in at the point where I've been working on some of the edges around that left side of Baxter. And that's the brightest part of the cat. You can see down the left hand side just how different those colours over there are in comparison to the right side of his face. So I've taken my soft pastel and I've used the white just to create some edge around the face to get going. I often like to start with the edges and work my way in. It just defines the outline of the animal again. And I spend quite a bit of time working on the edges, just defining them. Firstly with the soft pastel, then I'll come back in with pastel pencil and create the very finest little hairs that fly out over the edges. But initially, just trying to firm up the shape of the ear. Now you're going to see many layers using small marks to build up that nice thick fur effect in this project. I always find cat's fur so much more difficult than most other types of animal. I think it's just because of the density of their fur. So I always find that I've got to create more layers, smaller marks usually too. And with Baxter, he's a British grey cat. It's my sister's cat. My sister has several strays and rescue cats, but she also has a couple of really beautiful fancy cats too. And I just couldn't resist painting Baxter. I don't get to paint quite as many cats as dogs for some reason. I think every portrait artist ends up getting a little area that they specialise in. And I know that my speciality is probably dogs. Some people end up painting more horses than anything else. I think it's just where your passion lies often. But I really would like to paint more cats. I find them a real challenge. But they're such beautiful creatures. So I had a great time working on Baxter, and this was a nice opportunity to work on something for my sister. I don't often get time to do things for family members, but because of you guys on Patreon and the opportunity that I have to create tutorials from the work that I do, therefore not necessarily have to get paid for every piece that I paint as in commissioned work. It really has freed me up a little bit to be able to do some things like this for my family and friends. I'm sure many of you can relate to the idea that often your own family and friends get pushed further and further down the list as other work comes in and takes over. So she was over the moon to receive this, and I hope that you'll enjoy seeing lots of parts of this project. I've already released a full tutorial showing the build-up of the eyes. That's for level 3 patrons and above this month. But this series will show you all about the fur, how I build up the form of his head. And then in part 2, I'll work on down onto the body and show you all those slightly different lengths of fur on Baxter. So I've really just blocked in that other ear. And on this side, you can see the difference in the colours that I'm choosing to block in this ear. There's such a colour difference between one ear to the next. And most of what I'm going to talk about probably in this tutorial will be the light and the shade. So the difference in your colour choices between one side of the animal to the other really is key to creating the 3D effect and giving us a sense of that directional light. And I was lucky enough to be able to take these photos of Baxter myself when I was visiting home a few months ago. And Baxter posed like a pro, but I got him up next to some lovely window lighting where you get that strong light coming in from one side. And that's a great type of photo reference to look for when you're looking for photos to paint from. Try and choose one where you can really obviously see the direction of light, as those are great images to practice on. If you're trying to get to grips with colour theory and painting realistically, even if it's not high detail, I'm always saying that you don't necessarily have to go into this much detail to get something that really has a 3D appearance. That comes primarily from your colour choices. So the more you can try to observe the colours that you're actually seeing, the more you're going to get that convincing 3D look. So just picking out that little rim up the edge of the ear where the light's catching. And you'll see that I continue to use the soft pastels for much of this project. There is a lot of pencil work in it, but anywhere where I really want that strength of colour, that lovely rich pigment, it's those tiny pieces of soft pastel that I'm picking up. And as always, when I'm working around the edges of an animal, I can always use a little bit of background colour just to come back in and neaten that up. And just taking a little bit of the grey coloured Faber-Castell pastel pencil and continuing that line on down the other side of the ear. So it's nowhere near as pronounced on that side of the ear as it's over in the shadow. So there's a big contrast between the outline to the ear on the left and the outline on the ear on the right. I do feel like I repeat myself an awful lot when I'm talking about colours, but it really is the key to the realism that I try to achieve. Someone asked me this week, what would you attribute your progress to mainly? And it really is my work on colour theory and being able to identify the actual colour that I'm looking at, as opposed to letting my brain tell me what colour it should be. So the main thing that really adds to my realism is my colour choice. And that's why I go to the extra effort of adding in the colour codes in my tutorials. I think it's really important for you to see each and every colour that I'm using. Not so that you can go and get the exact same colours, although you can do that. You can see common colours that I use, really useful shades to have in your palette, and then you know exactly what colour to go and order. But at the same time, it's really just to show you the type of tones and values that I go for in certain areas, and to help you be able to substitute for whatever colours you have, or help you discover which colours might be useful to add to your own palette. That's the main tricky thing about pastel. Unlike with the wet mediums, oils, and acrylics, watercolor, you're mixing your colors. You mix all the colors that you need there. Whereas with pastel, a bit more similar to pencils, you're working with whatever colors you have in your palette. Of course, you can mix on the paper, and I layer up colors, trying to mix them, and I put marks together on the paper that get mixed by the viewer's eye from a distance. So you are using mixing techniques, but it's always important to have a good range of different shades available. And at the moment, I'm actually designing a new unison set. I haven't been able to tell anyone about it yet, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about it here, as it's quite relevant for this tutorial in particular. And it's going to be called Light and Shade. I'm putting together a 36 set, which gives you lots of alternative colours to use instead of white, grey and black. So how to add more colour into your work and find more interesting alternatives than the plain monochrome colours. So that's the set that I'm working on at the minute. I'm really excited to release that soon. Unison, I think, are planning to release that next month. And it's a set that I've had in my mind for quite a while, because I know how useful I would have found this set when I was first starting out with pastel. Understanding how to choose other colours than white in order to make an area lighter, and also finding more interesting greys and shadow colours. I think if I had have had this set when I was starting out, it would have helped me an awful lot. So that's where the idea of it has come from. You guys are really inspiring a lot of this stuff that I'm working on, because you draw my attention to the areas that are difficult when you're first starting out, and you really make me think about what I'm doing, and you really make me try to come up with a way to explain it. And I often just try to think of what I would tell myself 10 years ago if I could travel back in time and help myself out with some of this stuff. Because I certainly didn't start off doing pet portraits with all of this knowledge. I learned as I went, and it has taken me about 10 years to get this far. And I hope that through these tutorials I can speed that process up for you guys. It shouldn't take 10 years if you get pointed in the right direction. Definitely getting some good information and some useful critique and feedback speeds the learning process up. So you guys have access to a great world these days where you can get all sorts of tutorials online. But by doing this, by making these tutorials, I'm also learning so much. It's really making me analyse everything that I do. Sometimes that's a bad thing, but a lot of the time it helps me improve myself, looking back at what I've done. So, as I mentioned earlier, spending a long time on the edges, especially those sunlit edges, you'll always see me spend a long time on the areas that are being hit by the light. And although I've gone around the edge of the cat with soft pastel, then you can see when I come in with the white pastel pencil, I literally put the tip of the pencil into the soft pastel and really drag some of that out over the background. I'm not leaning very heavily with those marks, using a really nice sharp pastel pencil. And then picking up the grey for when I get just inside the boundary of that ear, and the light isn't catching those hairs quite as much, so I I pick up my slightly duller grey pastel pencil for this part. So always really analysing, is it pure white that I need? If you're unsure, compare it to some of the other colours around. I do remember that when I first started out, I used to use more white pastel than any other colour. And that very quickly changed when I discovered how I could apply colour theory to my work, and when I realised that even on a white subject, I needed very little actual pure white. So it went from being my most used colour in my pastel set to one of my least used colours, really. So I'm working on Pastelmat for this project. And I chose Pastelmat for this one in particular because I wanted to go all out on the detail. And I'm finding that Pastelmat really does allow for a huge amount of fine detail. I can get lots of detail on velour too, but with this one I really wanted the crispness of the eyes, those features to really pop. And the background wasn't too complicated either. I'm still shying away a little bit from plant life and landscape backgrounds on the Pastelmat. I haven't really delved into that too deeply yet. But with this type of background, I find it totally perfect for Pastelmat. Let me know if you'd like to see actually the background as a tutorial for this one. Of course, I can revisit any of the footage that I have created tutorials from. So if there are extra bits of any footage that you'd like to see a full length tutorial on, please do let me know. So starting to move in from the edges, and you'll see that I pick up several lovely light tones, some of these off-whites, of which I have many different colours, some warm, some cool. And I start to just block in a little bit of the texture of the cat now. So like with my dogs, I don't tend to come in with one big flat layer. You'll see that from the very start I tend to use small marks, already trying to build up the texture of the fur. So the more layers you can create with the small marks that show the direction and the texture of the fur, the more convincing the end result will be. You'll get a much thicker, more believable fur. So this grey tone, you're going to see me use this a lot throughout the piece. It's the equivalent of my sort of main underpainting colour, even though I'm not doing an underpainting as such. Just using it to mark in the direction of the fur, start to get a bit of a feel for the form. And I chose a really warm shade of Pastelmat paper for this. You can see that even though Baxter is a cool grey cat, there's so much warmth in his coat. The light that's coming in from the window is nice and warm. His surroundings have real warmth in it. So sometimes, especially for a cooler coloured animal, I'll go for a warm coloured paper, something to counter that. And I like the fact that this lovely sienna coloured Pastelmat Makes such a good mid-tone colour to work from. So with my white, just starting to pick out the shape of his cheek. All these little lines and forms on his face are really important. Equally as important as getting those eyes just right is getting the structure of the face, how it all fits together. And you can see that even with quite a fat little piece of pastel, I can still get those tiny marks that are required. And looking for those ridges down the forehead. He's got a really good face for painting. It's split up into lots of little segments. It gives you lots of shapes to look at and compare. And structurally, I'm just looking for those places that are being hit by the light, the side of each little ridge that's catching the light. And that's helping me just plot in some of those shapes on Baxter's forehead. So you can see the shape of this pastel. I think it's one that I dropped at some point, and that top part of the pastel must have broken off. And I'm never too sorry when I drop a pastel, because you end up getting really good shapes, little shards that become really useful for work like this. So if you've just bought some pastels, best advice is to get the papers off them. Don't worry about getting them dirtied or messy. They're really expensive. I understand that. I've had to build my collection of pastels over many years. But really treat them like tools. Treat them like something that's there to be broken and used. Once you've made your initial purchase, maybe you've got yourself a set of pastels to get going. Try and remember that once you've used one, it's not quite so bad just to replace that one pastel. They do last a long, long time. I have shards of pastel that I've had for years, and they're still used in many of my paintings. Obviously, you can never have too many, but you can get by with a surprisingly small number of pastels. And unless you're using one of the really rough papers, like the rough sanded papers, you'll find that your pastels go a long, long way. I find that on pastel mat and on velour, the pastels do seem to last a long time. So just working around the edges again. Making sure that my colours over here are slightly more muted than that sunlit side. So the little fine hairs inside this ear are quite muted. They don't stand out too much. So I chose to do those with the pastel pencil. So for the next couple of minutes, just building up the inside of that ear on the left. And now moving over onto the other ear, you'll see what a stark contrast this is. Much darker colours. Hard to believe that both ears belong to the same cat, really. But that's really the key to the colour work. Just trying to observe what you're actually seeing. Not letting your mind play tricks on you. And then picking up this lovely, almost lilac coloured, one of Unison's additional colours, which I love making use of instead of grey. This is one of the colours that's going to feature in my light and shade set. A really popular choice of mine. Just starting to flick some of those little hairs up over that ear on the right side. But you'll also see me come in with some warmer coloured pastels in amongst those lilacs and greys. I don't want to let it get too cold. So I'm going to be picking up some nice warm tones as well. I'm always surprised when I watch my footage back by how much I jump around on a piece. I'm not sure why. I'll start working on one area and then I'll get distracted by something over here. So I do jump around a lot. It makes tutorial video editing a bit of a nightmare. If only I could work a little bit more organised. But it's just the order that I see things to do. Sometimes while I'm making marks in one area, I'll realise that that colour I have in my hand also needs to appear somewhere else. All the time I'm just judging every area off the next. Always scanning my eye over the photo reference and over my work. Not getting too bogged down in one small area, I think, helps. To keep moving around the piece, comparing everything off its neighbour. So just starting to soften that edge further back into the face. I obviously don't want a really hard outline, so it's now just about gradiating that white fur into the shadow areas. And then I can also give it a nice rub with my fingertip. I don't tend to rub quite as much on Pastelmat as I do on velour. If you're trying out velour for the first time, it's quite different. It accepts many layers just like the Pastelmat, but I always recommend that you rub each layer really well into the velour paper. Pastelmat doesn't need that quite as much. When I rub the layers in on Pastelmat, it's more to get the effect that I want, to soften my marks. As one thing about Pastelmat is when I apply the marks, they're quite hard-edged. So unlike on velour, if you've tried it before, you'll know that when you make a mark, it actually looks quite soft. If I want to get a hard-edged mark on velour, I've really got to work at it. I've got to define it more. Whereas it's a little bit like the opposite, I suppose, on Pastelmat. I find that the marks I make are quite hard, and if it's a soft subject that I'm painting, then I've really got to work at it so that it becomes nice and soft. And that happens quite easily on this paper once I get a few layers of pastel on the paper. Then things start to move around a little easier. I also had a question from someone regarding that very thing this week, just about having trouble getting the pastel to move on the Pastelmat. And you really do need to have 2 or 3 layers of pastel on the paper before things start to blend and move nicely. So still going around trying to pick out little bits of structure, like where the light is catching around the lower rim. And how it sweeps around the top of the eye. And this is the main reason that I don't come in right away and paint the eyes. I like to create the space around the eyes, the shape of the sockets. I like to create all of that before committing to all the detail on the actual eyeball itself. I feel like I can almost get the likeness in these areas before I even get the eyeballs in. And I feel if I've got the likeness before the eyes go in, I'm in a good position when it comes to painting the eyes. But I know lots of artists work the complete opposite. Lots of people like to get the eyes in first. I say pretty much whatever you feel you'd like to do. I know I try to not let any rules or guidelines hold me back. I just work it as I feel it. And if you feel that you like to start with the eyes first, then absolutely start with the eyes. It's really interesting to see how each artist approaches something like this. Everyone works so differently. So while I'm making these tutorials to show you my techniques, they're by no means the only way or the right way to do something. So coming in a little darker now, this is also a very useful grey that I use throughout his coat. That darker grey there, you'll see me pick up a lot. And back in with my nice mid-tone grey to fill in some of the gaps. So I suppose on the sunlit side, I'm using my highlights to create the structure and then fill in the gaps with the mid-tone. And on the shadow side, I'm really using the darkest values to pick out the structure, all those little creases, and always in with the mid-tone to fill in the gaps. And as those marks come down in between the eyes, they get really small, mere dots as you come down the nose. So although Baxter's a very short-haired cat all over, there are definitely some different lengths of fur going on. From the top of his head, sort of medium length fur. On his nose, where it's really short. And then, as you'll see in part 2 of this tutorial, down in the body where it does get a little bit longer. So again, coming in with some more warm tones there. mixing that in amongst my cooler lilacs and my BV7, which is ultra cool. I love this colour. Icy cold. But I know that if I just use BV7 for highlights, I'll take all that warmth out of the coat. So I'm really trying to keep it warm, whilst also capturing that lovely steely grey. So we've got one eye in place. And it's always helpful when you get an eye or two in. Really gives the picture some focus. And I continue working on down the face with that nice mid-tone grey. You can see that I go back over the top of some of my lighter areas, just to add a bit more depth to the fur. And then at each stage I can come back in towards the end and really refine those edges and create some even more detailed marks using the pastel pencils. So it's a great combination, the soft pastels and the pastel pencils. My pencils are like my Dali sized paintbrush. I think Dali used to create some of his detail in his paintings with a paintbrush that had one hair. I've seen some of his paintings in person and they are incredibly small, much smaller than you expect, some of them. So the pencils to me are like having a really, really fine tipped brush, just to add the finest of detail. But sometimes I really feel that I can't get a strong enough or bright enough mark from the pastel pencil, so I'm still very much relying on the soft pastels even for those top layers where I'm adding extra detail. And you really can achieve such tiny marks from the soft pastel. Persevere with them. They take a while to get a feel of, especially if you're coming from coloured pencils or pastel pencils and you're used to having a pencil in your hand. It certainly takes a little while to get used to the feel of having these smaller pieces of pastel. And also if you're using the pan pastels, they also combine beautifully with the pastel pencils. In fact, anything pastel related works beautifully with other pastel products. Each seems to add its own usefulness to different areas of the medium. The soft sticks are definitely my favourite to work with, but It's great to be able to make use of the good aspects of all of the pastel products. So that's that left side of the face starting to take shape. Now to focus a little bit on the other shadow side. So again, coming in with one of my darker values over here. Starting to build that other eye socket. Looking at where some of those darkest creases lie. And you can see that lovely area that I'm just starting to work on now, where the light just catches Baxter's cheek, and then where his face recedes into the shadows, things do get really dark in there. So for the next minute or so, just building up some of that darker area. I even come in with something as dark as Brown Earth 36, just to add some extra depth to some of those deeper creases. It's often surprising how dark I need to go on these early layers. You've got to remember that when you're working from dark to light, often your first layers are going to look far too dark. And you got to trust that those mid-tones and then lastly the highlights will really bring it together. But it's all about being brave enough in the beginning with your darkest values. And as long as you're using a good pastel paper that can accept many layers, then the hope is that your mid-tones and your highlights bring out all of the detail while still allowing some of those darker marks to shine through. And it's using the full range of tonal values like that that will give even more depth to your 3D effect. So your tonal values are important. That's why when I give critiques, I often give back a version of your painting and your photo reference in grayscale beside each other to compare. That's a really useful thing to do, just to compare your painting and the photo reference both in grayscale. See how close you've got to the tonal values overall. Is there anywhere you need to go lighter? Is there anywhere you need to go darker? That'll answer that question immediately, where you may not be able to see it quite so easily, where there are colours to confuse things. Between your tonal values, so have you gone dark enough or light enough? Between that and your colour choices, how you choose to describe the value, what hue you actually choose. And that's where I'm talking about where I'm looking for warmth or where it needs to be cool, where I'm trying to find more colour than just monochrome grey. And it's really those two tricks combined that will give you that added realism. So coming in, just picking out some of the highlights up those ridges on his forehead. I've got the darkness in there, and I can just create these small marks in the direction up each little ridge. He's got such a wrinkly forehead. And there's a lovely little bit of light just catching around this side of his eye. Again, that's not bright white in there. Being very careful over on this shadow side of the face to avoid pure white most of the time. Using other tints and shades instead of my white highlight. And if you're just starting out with pastel, quite often the sets that you buy have lots of lovely vibrant colours in it, but they often don't have those more subtle shades that you're going to find you need. All of these off-whites, these alternatives for grey, very useful shades to have on top of those lovely vibrant colours that you get in most sets. So really this new set that I'm designing at the moment for Unison has been inspired by you guys and what I've done through my Patreon channel for the past year. This set really jumps out at me as something that would be of huge help. Especially when trying to get to grips with colour theory and think about ways you can introduce more colour into your work. I was looking through some of my older folders of work in search of some reference images, and I found a picture that I had painted about 9 or 10 years ago of a West Highland Terrier. And I had used pretty much all monochrome grey for the shadows and pure white pretty much all over. And it really made me smile because it was very much before the days when I had discovered how to bring more colour into my work. So I've definitely been there too. And at some point, the light bulb went on for me with colour, and then it's been a matter of practicing it ever since. It doesn't become easy. I still struggle to choose the correct colours. I still sit scratching my head, questioning what I've picked up. I pick up pastels and set them back down again. It certainly doesn't become easy, but the more you do it, the more of an instinct you get for it. And I know that once I started to bring all of these extra colours into my work, it totally transformed it. It took it from the 2D or more illustrative sort of appearance and started to bring me closer towards the realism that I seem to strive for. So just being careful with these little marks. You can see how they sweep around the shape of the cat's face, round from the nose and up towards the ear. And the direction of those marks is so important to creating the form of the face. So you can see that once I've got those dark greys in there, my mid-tones now really start to bring that together, and I can still see some of those lovely dark marks shining through. So I've kept the individual features like the eyes for a separate tutorial, but I thought that I would include the nose in this. It's such a tiny nose anyway. So I've sped some parts of it up a little bit, but you will get to see the colours that I used and the order that I placed those down. Nice bit of a fleshy colour there going in, and then back in with some pastel pencil just to neaten around the edges again. But again, most of my main colour going in with the big chunky sticks. And then really using the pencils to come in and shape it all into place. I think I just like to call pastel pencils my Dali brushes from now on. I definitely liken the way I work more to painting than to drawing, to be honest. Soft pastel is one of those mediums that it's sort of in a world of its own. You can draw with it, but in many pastel artists' view, you can also paint with it. And I definitely think of my technique a bit closer to a painting technique. It's very much how I would build up an oil painting, working from dark to light. In a similar fashion, I can take a paintbrush loaded with oil paint and create a line drawing. So to me, painting and drawing doesn't necessarily come from whether the media is wet or dry. To me, it's the technique itself that's important. And I'm often using the soft pastels on their side, like with the background, for example, blocking in large areas of colour, just as I would with an oil painting. So that's why I refer to my work as pastel paintings. And it's a bit of a grey area in the art world, to be honest. And it only really matters when it comes to categorising your work, either for sale or in competitions, etc. Because it doesn't really matter most of the time if people call them a drawing or a painting. I don't really care. Both are equally valid, in my opinion. But it does matter a little bit when it comes to selling your work through galleries or entering it in painting competitions, for example. So it's quite a debated topic in the art world. I feel that pastel is often a bit misunderstood. But to me, pastel is the most direct way to apply pigment to a surface. You've got the pigment in its purest form. It's mostly colour pigment with a small amount of binder added just to hold the thing together. And oil paints and all other paints are the same base pigments, but obviously with liquids added, oil-based liquids, water-based liquids. So to me, pigment is the original way to paint, even though it's a dry medium. And some people have also been discussing the idea of adding water to your pastel work, either in the form of an underpainting or using pastel as part of mixed media. It's not something that I've done in recent years, but certainly in art college I experimented a lot with mixed media, and pastel is wonderful to use along with underpaintings. Maybe that's something I'll try in the near future. You guys keep affording me the luxury of doing some experimenting, so next time I get some free time in my diary, maybe some mixed media might be fun to try. But I do find it really hard to tear myself away from soft pastel. Every time I try to create something in a different medium, I end up just falling back into soft pastel. I just love this stuff. Highly, highly addictive substance. And I think by the look of many of your paintings, I think many of you have been bitten by the bug also. So just coming back in through this fur on the shadow side of the face, picking out any of the brightest highlights, but of course not using any of the pure white over here. So my brightest highlight over here is more like the blue violets, the lightest blue violets. And I've got a lovely sharp piece of pastel here, one that I've broken, and just perfect for making those smaller marks. So like with everything else I paint, just taking my time, really studying the photo reference, planning the direction I'm going to make those little marks before I make them. And the odd time picking up one of my Pan Pastel soft applicators. They're great on the pastel mat, especially just for softening, blending some marks into the paper a little. So coming back to that really dark ear, and I'll spend the next few moments just adding a bit more depth in there, and then adding some of those finer, wispy hairs inside the ear. Now, once I'm happy that I've got enough darkness inside that ear, I take a nice sharp piece of pastel and start creating some of those finer hairs inside the ear. You can see that they really are a nice bluey colour. So now we jump on a little bit, and I've blocked in some of the colours up the back, just behind the head. But for the next while, I'm going to focus on that muzzle area. How to get the 3D effect of that muzzle, how to make it really sit out. And cats have a really distinctive shape of a muzzle. They've got their higher up cheek areas, and then these two areas to either side of the nose have a very distinctive shape. But first I'm coming in again with the darker colours, and the main areas of darkness I can see are those holes that the whiskers come sprouting out of. So using that grey that I've used on the shadow side, just filling in some of the areas around the mouth and those, well, we'll call them whisker holes. I'm not sure if there's a technical term for them. But then also using some of my highlight colour, just picking out that area that comes down from the left side of the nose. Again, really looking at the photo reference as I work. Trying to line everything up with things that I've already got in place. So where each of these little rows of whiskers come from, and the angle that they come down from the nose towards the outside of the face. And again over here, I suppose I'm using these highlight colours just to block in the form. Picking out those areas that are being hit by the light, the ones that are really catching the light. And that sort of finishes off around that outer shape of his face. And I'm always using my negative spaces as well, just to make sure that I've got the anatomy of things right. So when I look at the wall behind Baxter, behind that outer edge of his face, is that negative area roughly the same shape as in the photo reference? You can see that it's not totally rounded, the shape of his face. You sort of get a flat line that comes from the top of the head, where the ear is, down to the left of his eye. That's sort of a straight line. Then from that point down to just where I'm working at the moment, you get another, not quite straight, there's a bit of a curve to it, but it does seem to come down to a little point somewhere just to the left of the muzzle. And then continuing on down to where the face meets the body. So really using the features of the cat to measure against, to see if I've got that outer shape of the face right. And I usually do my initial sketches using a grid. It helps me, well, it speeds me up a lot. I do like to freehand sketch and draw, but for a lot of my commissions, a lot of my work, I do use a grid just to speed myself up a bit and to ensure accuracy, that I don't meet any serious problems later on that can't be sorted out during the painting process. Normally by the time I get to the colour work, I've got the proportions pretty close, and then small adjustments can be made as I go. And again, coming in with the white pastel pencil, just dragging some of that pigment out over the page, but using the lovely fine tip of the pencil to get those little flyaway hairs. And if I don't lean heavily with this, I can make those little hairs extremely fine. And I can also blend them into the paper a little bit just to knock them back. So working on at the muzzle area, you've got that little line that comes down from the centre of the nose and seems to split off into the mouth. And want to get those little soft hairs that come down over the top of that line from both sides. All the time just looking at how the marks of the fur fan out from the nose. And again, being sure to use more of my shadowy colours on this side of the muzzle. And especially just in around this area, we've really got a dip down away from the light. Really nestled in there between the nose and the other eye. So again, in with my nice mid-tone grey. It's a great base colour, this grey, for Baxter in particular. But I also make use of some pure black in Baxter's fur. You can see just how dark it is around that crease between his face and his neck. And it might look really dark to use black in this case. But again, my midtones and highlights will bring it all together. If I don't get this depth in here, I just won't achieve that shadowy effect. For the next couple of moments though, just working on the mouth area with the combination of the pencils and the soft sticks, and the muzzle area just to the left of the mouth. So now that I've built up some of those highlights on the left side of the face, it really starts to take shape. Now I want to start working on this mouth area. Again, it's got some darkness in here, so just dotting in a bit of my black before coming in with my greys and mid-tones. And again, I want to keep it all nice and warm. I love this colour, Brown Earth 21. I use it so much in my work, all sorts of different colours of fur. I even use it in people portraits. It's a lovely fleshy tone. And this is almost like a darker version of it. Both of those colours really useful. Very muted sort of colour. Not a lot of vibrance to it, but not as dull as pure grey. Not quite as warm as brown. Definitely got a nice muted effect to it. Perfect for when you're working within the shadows. And it's definitely all of these strange off shades that come in most useful when you're working in pastel. So even though this is a grey cat, you can see just how many colours I've put into this piece. Lots of lilacs and blues, fleshy browns, pale brown earths. But I'm really not making it up when I look closely at my photo reference. I really can see all of those colours in there, and it's just about training your eye to see those colours. And at the beginning, when I found that really difficult, and I've suggested this a few times, but if you haven't heard in one of my other tutorials, if you have access to Photoshop, there's a tool on there called Eyedropper. And if you bring your photo reference in, you can use the eyedropper to actually select a colour so that you can see it as a flattened colour. And it's often a good trick to use when you're struggling with choosing the right colours. And it can really point you in the right direction. After a while, you won't need it anymore. Your eyes will start to believe what they're seeing, and you'll be able to trust the colours that you're seeing. But certainly in the beginning, it's a great tool to use. Even Andrew, when he was trying to do some oil painting, he doesn't do a lot of art, but sometimes he'll take a notion and have a go at something. And he had some really good results with a little oil painting just from making use of that eyedropper tool to pick out the correct values. And it's a great training tool. We're often looking at colours expecting to see something rather than really looking at the colour we're seeing. And it's tricky, it's really difficult. It's good to compare those values constantly to each other. And that's why it's really nice to get a photo where you get such strong directional lighting, as that effect is really obvious in this image. On other images where the lighting is a bit flatter, sometimes it's harder to pick out those subtle colours, but when you get good directional lighting within a photo reference, it definitely makes life easier to see the difference from one side to the other. So sunlit photo reference, or photos like this where that natural soft light is really obvious on one side of the face. Those are great images to practice on, especially if you're looking to work on building up that 3D effect. So just using the pastel pencil in some of the areas where the hairs are really, really short. Just coming back in, adding a bit more depth in between my midtones. Even though I'm always saying to work from dark to light, it's not 100% strict rule. You can always come back in with more darks. That area underneath this eye, just picking up a lovely bit of light, creates a lovely shape sweeping up underneath Baxter's eye. He's such a pretty cat. Definitely the prettiest cat I've painted. I hope you've been enjoying some of the cat reference images this month. I've tried to include a range of different cats. But Baxter is certainly a great face to practice on, to learn from. And those tiny little marks now, just where the fur is at its absolute shortest in around the nose and on the muzzle area. You can see the difference in the length of my marks here to, for example, on the top of his head. So not just the direction of the marks, but the length of the marks also makes a big difference. So time to pick out that chin area and really bring the mouth to life. So looking for the highlighted area, just to pick out the main structure, the shape of it. Trying to gradate those lighter marks up towards the darkness in around the creases of the mouth. So I've tried to include as much of the footage of Baxter as possible, hence the quite long tutorial this month. So I hope you guys like seeing a bit more of the footage. This piece took me such a long time to build up. You can see that it's so many layers and so many tiny marks, and I really want to include as much of the footage as possible just to give you a good idea of the time spent on this and the amount of times that I revisit one particular area just to add more layers. Of course, it never feels like that when I'm actually working on them. Time just seems to evaporate when I'm painting. It feels like I've just hit record on the camera, and all of a sudden, an hour and a half later, the camera's bleeping at me that the card's full, so it's always a surprise that that time has passed. I'm sure you find the same when you sit down to paint, or do anything creative really. Time just seems to fly. So bringing in some of the highlight colours there, but trying to leave some of those gaps for the darker holes where the whiskers are going to protrude from. And the whiskers are the last thing I'll do. Hopefully most of you have already seen that video. I released that earlier in the month, showing how I created the whiskers. But it makes sense to me to leave those until the very end, as they're right on top of everything else. But it's important at this stage when you're creating the muzzle to get the placement of those holes right, as that's where you're going to create those whiskers coming out of. And again, the whiskers really help with the structure of the face and a lot of the personality too. I've already mentioned Dali in this tutorial, but Baxter's whiskers, especially those top two whiskers, he's just got such a Dali mustache going on. So much character in his face. And I think that's why I don't get quite so frustrated or bored when I'm working on people or animal portraits. Even though I like painting backgrounds and I enjoy landscape, I didn't always. I did find them a major struggle in the beginning, and I avoided doing them. I really just did pet portraits, the floating head style of portrait, portraits with no background, portraits with just a plain colour in the background. And I avoided painting anything really other than animals and people. And those are still two of my favourite things to work on, just for the reason that it's so satisfying to sit and build up the face of something that's living, and after a while it's looking back at you. So I find that really satisfying, and time really flies when I'm working on a face like this. Whereas I do still find it really difficult to work on areas of a lot of foliage or tricky grass, like the piece that I've just finished painting with a lot of very tangled grass around a dog. And I still find that really difficult, so it's not like I find it easy these days. I just know that I'll get there eventually. But it's still sometimes not my favourite thing to be working at. I absolutely love working on faces, things that after a while become animated and you've got a bit of a character to look at while you work. But by forcing myself to work on backgrounds and to attempt landscapes and just to try everything and persevere at it, it really has improved my skills as an artist. I feel that if I had stuck with painting only living creatures and people, that I wouldn't have progressed this far. It's definitely in painting the backgrounds and the inanimate objects that I've learnt the most. And it has taught me to just look at everything in the same way. It's just shapes, forms, colour, no matter what you're painting. So I always encourage people to break out of your comfort zone. Try something different. Don't beat yourself up when it doesn't go particularly well. A lot of my early attempts at all sorts of different subject matters weren't very good. Definitely my early attempts at landscape, it was something I was never really drawn to before. And the thing that really helped me the most was, again, use of colour and colour theory. It just has seemed to rescue me so many times. Once I got to grips with using a broader colour range, I was just able to tackle so many more different subject matters. So that's why I'm always preaching on at you about colour. It's definitely the main thing that will leapfrog your work forward. So I'll try to think of some other shorter videos that I can make based on just colour, as I know it's the area that I struggled most with at the start, and I see it all the time with you guys and other artists. It's definitely an area that everyone struggles with, I think, at the start. So I will try and think of some other videos that I can make to explain colour theory a little more in depth. So working over that really dark side of the face, I don't want to lighten it too much. When you're looking at the photo reference from a distance, you can really see how solid and dark that whole side of the face is. But of course I want to break up the darkness a little bit. Lots of warmth in there as well as my greys. And then the next part, you're going to see me work on down the body, how I create, again, that lighting effect on the body. And it's even more apparent down there because you're going to see the sweep around the chest, around the front of the chest, where it changes from sunlit into shadow. So I hope that all of this is very useful. This has been quite a long part 1. And I'm going to give up on the narration. I think my voice has lasted pretty well today. I'm just recovering from bronchitis. So I'll leave you with the last few minutes of footage. And I'll join you again with part 2 when we finish off Baxter. So I'll chat to you soon in part 2.